Most of us spend our careers optimizing for success, better roles, more responsibility, more recognition, only to wake up one day and wonder, why don't I feel any better? My guest today, Karen Dillon, was living the dream on paper as the editor of the Harvard Business Review. Then one conversation with the legendary thinker Clayton Christensen changed everything. He asked her a question most of us spend years avoiding. How will you measure your life? Not your career, not your salary, but your life. That conversation became a book and a wake up call for her and everyone who's ever felt that they're succeeding at the wrong things. In this episode, we unpack how rigorous business theories can guide life decisions, why grit alone can often mislead us, and how to actually figure out what matters before it's too late. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, Karen.
Thank you, Charles. I'm really happy to be here.
Before we get started, I'd love to have our audience learn more about you and your work. Now, you've led an incredible career as a journalist, editor, and now best-selling author. What drew you to collaborate with Clayton Christensen on this project, and did you expect it to reshape your own life?
So absolutely not is the answer to that question. But the reason is I was at the time that I ended up working with Clay on what became this project, I was the editor of Harvard Business Review magazine, as you mentioned. And I was just an editor on a deadline looking for an extra article to fill a double issue that we had coming out. And at the time, I was looking for something that was relatively easy, not a deep academic dive on something. And it was the spring of 2010. The reason that date matters is because I thought it might be interesting to ask the soon-to-be graduating class of Harvard Business School whether or not their own definition of success had changed or been recalibrated during their time in Harvard Business School. Why was that time relevant? Because that particular class had applied for and been accepted to and started at HBS when the economy was booming. And it's almost immediately after they got there, the recession kicked in. And I just thought, that's interesting. They've had 2 years to think about what they want to do with their life when they come out. Has it changed at all? And in the course of calling students, I ended up talking to the president of the graduating class, and he told me they had asked Clay Christensen, who, as you mentioned, is one of the most well-known, well-regarded professors in the world, thinkers in the world, had given a talk to the graduating class that they had found profoundly moving. And he didn't really even tell me much about what he said, but I knew Clay was so famous and so well known. I didn't know him personally, but he was just such a respected thinker that whatever he said, I could turn into some kind of an essay for Harvard Business Review. So I really was just trying to fill a hole in the magazine. And so I called him and asked him if I could come and try to turn whatever that talk had been into something for the magazine. And he said yes, which in hindsight, I realized was incredible because he was one of the busiest men in the universe, most sought after men in the universe. Our conversation that day about what he told the graduating class and what I was trying to turn into a message for our readers became a very personal message for me too. But because of that conversation, over the next year or so, I really just rethought my entire life in a way, trying to refocus my priorities. And as a result, I ended up leaving my job as the editor of Harvard Business Review with goodwill on both sides. And my husband and I sort of reframed our life to reprioritize the things we decided were more important to us. So because of a chance conversation with the president of the class, I ended up talking to Clay, and then it ended up being both a life reframing and then what was a wonderful 10 years of collaborating with Clay and other work.
I'm curious, what was it about that last class lecture that convinced you that these lessons need to be shared with a wider audience?
It was interesting time even to be asking that question in 2010 because you may remember that there were a number of scandals that came out of graduates of Harvard Business School. Probably the most famous one at the time was the CEO of Enron, who found himself in jail. Clay's big message was not, how do you take all the tools I've given you in this classroom to make good decisions for your company? It's more important to make good decisions for your life. And that was the beginning of what felt so powerful to me. And then what we ended up working on for another decade.
Let's dive into some of the theoretical foundations that make this approach so powerful. People often think that the best way to predict the future is by collecting as much data as possible before making a decision. But this is like driving a car looking at the rear view mirror only because data is only available for the past. There are many times in life where we simply can't afford to learn on the job. You don't want to have to go through multiple marriages to learn how to be a good spouse. or wait for your last child to be grown to master parenthood. How can we, instead of relying on the past and these anecdotes, how can we use solid theory to understand what causes outcomes and be able to more confidently predict the future?
It's a good question and one that I struggled with myself in the beginning because Clay was famous for his belief in the power of business theory. And to me, that sounds so abstract, business theory, even for businesses making decisions. But really at its core, business theory is saying, how can we understand what causes what to happen? And until we understand the cause and effect of decisions, we may not make decisions with the right outcome. He was not a guy that believed that looking back was going to predict the future. And so his goal was to help his students pull the theories that he taught in his class. He'd call it their toolbox, kind of on their shelf, pull them down when they needed them so they could think about, does this theory apply in this context and in this decision I'm making so that I understand if I make this choice, what will happen? Again, initially, he's teaching his whole classes for them to make decisions for their future companies. His course was called Building and Sustaining Successful Enterprise, BSSE, which is the most boring title. It was the most popular class at Harvard Business School for years. But those tools become very powerful when you recognize that they can help you make decisions about a lot of things, including your life. When you understand the causal mechanism, the choice will lead to this outcome, you can then start to make choices in a much more knowing way rather than relying on what happened in the past, which may have been context specific or may have not been relevant to the decision you're making. You're making something with an understanding of what the consequence may be.
And so much of our thinking, or what's become popular thinking, isn't grounded on anything more than a series of anecdotes. I agree with what is stated in the book. Solving the challenges in your life requires a deep understanding of the causes, like you mentioned, of why it happened. So, good theory helps people steer toward good decisions, not just in business, but in life.
Good theory is just useful in so many ways once you understand its power and you understand that it's not universal. There's no one theory that explains everything. And in fact, Clay himself was really focused on trying to make his theories stronger, to understand what they didn't explain, what might need a different theory to explain it.
And when giving advice, it's critical to decide which theory or mental model to apply so that you can explain it to others. And really what this book taught me was, don't give answers directly to people when they ask you questions. Instead, run the question through a theory in your mind so you know what theory is appropriate and what it says and the likely results of that course of action. And he never gave the answers directly. It was always just, here's how this problem was solved in a different industry. You make the inferences and try to apply it to your problem.
That's true. It's really interesting. He used to say that he would get calls from the great and the good from all over the world. I can just tell you from sitting in his office, CEOs and political leaders, and he would always say, "I don't know anything about your particular industry or challenge, but what I do know are the theories that you may find useful for you to apply." There was a review, I think, in the Financial Times when the book first came out and called it the ultimate self-help book because it was not going to solve your problems for you, but it was going to help you solve them for yourself. He would never presume to give you the answer to the question you asked him about a struggle you were having. He would give you the tools so you could answer it yourself.
I love how that approach, how it's really teaching you how to think, not necessarily giving you the answers. And that's the power of theory. Let's get into one of the most practical theories in the book, and that's Herzberg's two-factor theory. How do you explain the difference between hygiene factors and motivation factors for someone hearing this theory for the first time? Because this is not the most common motivation theory out there.
It's a great question. It's a very simple explanation of why so many people find themselves not super happy in their jobs or their careers. And it's trying to understand what really motivates us to want to get up out of bed in the morning and go to work and do whatever it is we want to do. People make decisions about their career often based on hygiene factors. And hygiene factors I would describe as all the things you talk about with people at a cocktail party. What's my title? How prestigious is my organization? Do I get a good parking space? Is my office good? Do I have vacation time? Does the job title sound impressive to people? Things that are reasonable things to make decisions on. But in Herzberg's world, the scale of hygiene factors for a job goes from dissatisfied. I am dissatisfied with the hygiene factors, therefore my job does not make me happy. It does not motivate me. But the top of that scale is I am not dissatisfied with the hygiene factors in my job. Now, not being dissatisfied with your job is good, But is it good enough? Who wants to just not be dissatisfied with your job? You want to grow and love and enjoy your job and be really motivated by it. So in his thinking, and Clay and I really believe this, there's a separate scale that you have to take into account as well, which we called intrinsic motivators. And these are the things that you may have to think a little bit harder about when you're making decisions in your job or explaining what you love about your job to other people. They're things that are less visible, but that may make the difference to motivation in the long run. Am I given chances to grow and learn? Do I believe in the mission of the organization? Am I respected by my peers, and do I respect them? So the top of that scale on both of those measures is really important for the people who really thrive in their jobs in the long run. There was for years, and it came out of the 80s and 90s, there was the idea that you could sort of incent people to do what you want them to do as a manager. That's where all the idea of stock options came from. I will pay you to do what I want you to do. And that does work for a little while, but it doesn't work over the long run. It really doesn't. It's not the reason people jump out of bed. They get up to the top of the hygiene factors with that, but they don't get up to the true intrinsic motivators.
That's a great insight, and thanks for unpacking that for us. I love what you say about those hygiene factors like status, compensation, and job security. At best, you won't hate your job anymore. It can eliminate dissatisfaction, but it can't create satisfaction. And so many people get that wrong in thinking that it's going to solve both of those issues. But like what you stated, those intrinsic motivating factors, challenging work, recognition, responsibility, personal growth, feelings that you're making a difference and contributing to something more are really those conditions that motivate you and make it more satisfying. And if you get those motivators that work right, you're going to love your job. Even if you're not making piles of money, you're going to be motivated.
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't know to think about it when you're making the decisions, you may be lumping along with just not dissatisfied, but we spend so much of our waking time in our whole life in our jobs. Why not aim for something higher than not dissatisfied?
How about for questions that people should ask themselves on a regular basis to make sure they're focusing on motivators that truly lead to long-term fulfillment?
Well, I think the self check-in is really important because there are good reasons to take jobs that may not start off initially having all those intrinsic motivators, but there are other good reasons.
And some of those questions you list in the book to truly help find fulfillment is the work meaningful to me? Is the job going to give me a chance to develop? Am I going to learn new things? And will I have an opportunity for recognition and achievement? So some of those questions are a good starting point to make sure that you're focusing on those motivators that truly lead to long-term motivation and success. Well, let's talk about strategy formation. How does Sam Walton's decision to open his second store in Bentonville illustrate the difference between a deliberate strategy and an emergent one, which I think a lot of leaders still struggle with? When to switch, which ones to focus on when?
So I'll start with the sort of misconception that a lot of people may have, maybe people who haven't started businesses, that businesses that are successful have a clear strategy and execute it. And they're successful in their strategy execution from the beginning. They know what they want to do, their strategy is set, and they go. But in reality, there's ample research that tells us that the majority of businesses that are successful don't end up with exactly the same strategy that they started with. And so a business that was so laser focused on what we call a deliberate strategy, this is going to be our strategy and this is how we will execute it, but was not open to ideas or strategies or changes in context that they didn't think about in the beginning, may not succeed at all. So it may be in the data of those that did not succeed. Those that do are those who are able to adapt their strategy. And that often comes in what we call emergent strategy. So the difference is deliberate is what you plan and think and know. You're putting your resources into this is where we're going. Straight path, leader, take me, I follow, etc. The emergent strategy is the idea that until you're kind of really in the context of exploring your idea and seeing where the market need is and seeing where your resources are most effective and you can leverage, etc., you may not have the right strategy. So you need to be open your aperture to opportunities that you don't see in the beginning and then recognize them when you see them. And Sam Walton is a great example. The story is told that he opened his first store not in a major metropolitan area, but in Bentonville, Arkansas, which was where his wife insisted they live. She didn't want to leave the home and friends and family. She wanted to stay in her niche. So he did that as a way of appeasing his wife, keeping his marriage a priority in his life. And who on earth would have thought that opening what we now know as Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas, saw would end up being a stroke of strategic genius. And it was an emergent strategy that came from that sort of chance decision he made. Once he realized that that was so successful, he turned that emergent strategy into a deliberate strategy, meaning once you recognize that you are on the right path, you've seen an opportunity, you haven't missed it, you haven't squandered that. Now you need to double down and go forward with that strategy because that's how you're going to win. It's why companies don't die when their innovation is overclips is by something else, is because they're constantly going back and forth between emergent, seeing opportunities and deciding to explore them, and deliberate, let's make the most of it. And you have to be prepared to do both. And the same is true in our careers. It's very rare that somebody knows at age 25, these are the my 5-year plan and the 10-year plan, and that all happens. You really need to be interplaying between emergent and deliberate strategy for your career to get to the right place.
Absolutely. Try stuff until you learn where your talents, interests, and priorities begin to pay off. When you find out what really works for you, then it's time to flip from an emergent strategy to a deliberate one. Can you share an example of how testing the most important and least certain assumptions have helped you or a company you studied avoid a costly mistake?
It's a tool that is labeled called discovery driven planning, which sounds really boring, but it's actually really practical. The idea is that so many of us make decisions on the factors in our mind at the time, but then we get into a job or our business is going down that route. And we sort of forget and retrofit what our original assumptions were that helped us make that decision. And when you sort of forget them, you never go back to check if they prove to be true. Are we on track or not? A great example of this is Euro Disney, which was almost a flop when it first opened. And they made all of the assumptions that they had made for the successful launch of the new ones in America. How many days would a typical visitor stay? What would the revenue projections be? Those were baked in very early in their planning assumptions. And then they went ahead, and as time went on, they ended up deciding to make it a little bit smaller and maybe do some different things. And then when it opened, they were stunned that their revenue per guest was way lower than it had been in the US ones. And it was only when they went all the way back to their original planning assumptions that they recognized a mistake they had made, or a mistake that they hadn't taken into account to adjust, was that the Disneys in the US had 3 days worth of rides, and Euro Disney had 2 days worth of rides and attractions. And so until they recognize we can't simply assume people will spend an extra day anyway, that they were able to adjust and course correct and get themselves back on track. It's the mistakes or the assumptions that you forget were baked into your decision that may mean you end up going off track without even realizing why. We're all in agreement about why we're making this decision and we're going forward. And then 6 months later, we forget that we said this would be a great test case to learn X, and we're expecting high level results, or we forget that we said this would be a great opportunity to mentor junior people. We never put them into the project. You can choose to course correct or not, but at least you have a better understanding of why it's not going as you might have imagined. In your career, you can do the same thing too. When you make decisions about job choices, you're making assumptions. I'm assuming this job will stretch me. I'm assuming this job will give me visibility in the company that will provide me with other opportunities. I'm assuming that the promise that I could work in emerging markets will be a big part of my job. They're things that you just want to kind of record for yourself so that you can go back and look at it and say, did these things prove to be true? And if they did prove to be true, great, you're on track. If some of them didn't, you then have a moment to say, do I need to do anything different to get these assumptions back into the everyday life of my decisions?
And it's as simple as even asking yourself, what are the assumptions that have to be proven true in order for me to succeed in this assignment with this choice? It's equally applicable to personal and professional life that are within my control, because just asking that, being more deliberate with those questions, pays off a lot in the end. And I've seen this personally, I've seen this professionally in my life as well, because we don't understand or realize the assumptions we're making, and we just go full heartedly into those decisions or into that mindset to say, okay, this is what's going to happen. And then when it doesn't work out, you're left questioning yourself, right?
And I think also even having the conversation out loud, if it's a career decision with the hiring manager or with your new colleagues, we might all be making well-intended assumptions, but we're not communicating them to each other. And so we're never going to be syncing up in some way. So I think it's a valuable tool as a manager, if you're leading people or you're reporting to someone, to kind of have check-ins on your assumptions. I'm assuming that you're going to be giving me more responsibility in the next, 6 months. Is that happening or not? Or I am assuming that you're going to step up to this level of skill and expertise and work at it so I can give you more responsibility, whatever it is. If you haven't had that communication conversation, the chances are that you'll both have a slightly different view of what those assumptions are. And therefore, neither of you are going to be happy with how it's turning out.
Let's move on to another one of his theories. And he mentions in the book successful companies don't succeed because they have the right strategy at the beginning. They succeed because they have money left over after the original strategy fails so that they can pivot and try another approach. And this is demonstrated by a story that he shares about Honda, how financial constraints really led to accidental success because they wanted to enter the US motorcycle market in the late 1950s. And it wasn't successful at the start.
It's a great story because, as we all know, you can drive down any town in America or within some radius of any town in America, you'll see a Honda dealership someplace, and Honda's all over the road. Honda is clearly one of the most successful stories of car stories, automobile industry in the world. But its start in America went really wrong and could have completely derailed it if it hadn't been open to checking in with itself and making some decisions and having some cash left over. What happened was Honda initially decided it wanted to break into the American market in the motorcycle market. It saw the very successful US manufacturers like Harley Davidson, all that road, all that open road all over America. We can get some of our products in there. That'll be our toehold. We'll get our foot in the door with our motorcycles. And so they opened one shop in Los Angeles to showcase their best model. They opened up the showcase and nobody came, or whoever came in looked and walked away because these motorcycles looked like toy motorcycles compared to a big Harley Davidson open road motorcycle. And they did not understand why people were not coming. In frustration, they were going to try to figure out if they could send the product back. Ended up thinking we don't have enough money to send it back. We're just going to try to fix what we have there and see if we can get rid of this inventory. And then maybe that's the end of our foray into America. But in frustration, one of the sales managers one day took one of those motorcycles, which were called Super Cubs, out into the dirt hills, the ones you see by the Hollywood sign, and just started riding around, just having fun, blowing off some steam. And you don't see Harley Davidsons riding around those hills of Hollywood. And it turned out that it was really fun for him to be going up and down those hills, and he went a lot. And it turned out one day there was a buyer for Sears. Can we put this in our sporting goods department, which is inside a store, not even in a showroom? We'd all walk past the women's lingerie and the whatever, and there's the sporting goods department. And Honda said, absolutely not. We are going to compete with Harley Davidson. You don't do that coming in a Sears department store. But luckily, they recognized enough emergent and deliberate strategy that maybe they could pivot and see this as an opportunity. And they did have enough money to sort of see this into fruition. And so they decided, okay, we'll let them sell. And it turned out, as we all know, to create a whole new category of recreational vehicles. And it was very successful. These little Cubs that were not suitable for open roads, but they were great on hills and they were great in cities. And that was the beginning of Honda beginning to understand and then conquer the market. But had they not had resources left over, had they not been open to the emergent opportunity, and had they not sort of had the experiment that happened by accident, we may never have known Honda as the great global giant that we do now.
Great story. And that financial discipline imposed by necessity rather than choice became the foundation for Honda's eventual dominance of the American motorcycle market. And this story showcases how resource constraints can force companies to discover strategies they never would have pursued if they had abundant capital. So it's a great story. Thank you for providing some insights regarding that. One question that I always wanted to ask you was, in the book, it says high achievers overinvest in their careers and underinvest in their families, even though they know relationships bring deeper long-term happiness. And this really hits at the heart of what Clay called the resource allocation process. It's one of the most dangerous traps of successful people. And if you study the root causes of business disasters over and over, you'll find a predisposition for endeavors that offer immediate gratification over endeavors that result in long-term success.
We explained the dilemma really well, and we can be reminded of the deep research that the single biggest cause of long-term happiness are close personal relationships. But knowing that and living your life that way are two different things, and it's a challenge, even though you sort of intellectually know that. And I call it the high achiever paradox, because I think what happens is high achievers are so hardwired to do the thing, to devote their time, energy, focus, their resources to the things that give us the most clear and fastest return on our investment, as many companies do. The ROI of how we spend our energy, our time, and our focus as individuals. You can see the ROI much more quickly on, do you close a big sale? Do you make a presentation that goes well? Do you rally your team together through a difficult challenge? Those are things that seem to pay off for you on a daily basis in some ways. And it's just so tempting to give our energy and time and focus to the things that shout the loudest and pay us back the fastest than it is to the things that may be the slower burn, both positive and negative. And so it's the reason so many high achievers end up not with the life that they imagined or wanted because they are unintentionally executing a strategy that is not going to make the things that are going to make them happiest in the long run their priority. They're prioritizing things that pay off for them fastest. And that's the paradox of it. You know it, but we're all kind of drawn to the things that we know will pay off most quickly. And work is full of shiny bells and whistles of ROI on things and the hard challenges and you overcome it, you feel good about yourself. There's so many things that pay off on a quarterly basis rather than 25 years, which is what parenting and marriages typically are. So it's a struggle. And you have to understand that the choices you make, your strategy is really formed in the everyday decisions you make about how you'll spend your time and your energy and your personal focus. Just as a company's strategy is not what it says its strategy is. It's what the decisions that all the employees make on an everyday basis. The strategy execution is in all those choices on what matters more than something else. The strategy is not just a kind of mission statement thing that comes down from the C-suite. It is formed in all of those individual decisions by all of the employees of the company. Same is true for us as individuals. It's formed in all of our everyday choices about how we spend our time, our energy, and our focus.
Thank you for providing that. And you're right. There's that paradox there. We have that short term focus, even though we realize it's not going to pay dividends in the future. It's really hard to resist. We always have that temptation for the quick fix, the hack, or those things that are going to pay off sooner rather than later. We discount the future in many cases too much. Let's turn to another theory, the jobs to be done theory, which was originally developed for business, but is incredibly powerful for relationships as well. Companies focus too much on what they want to sell customers rather than what those customers actually need. And what's missing often is empathy. How does this apply to personal relationships? And what can individuals learn from this framework when it comes to their marriages, their families?
So the jobs to be done theory, again, sort of a mouthful, but it's really a very simple way of trying to understand what causes a customer to purchase one product or service over another. What causes them to make that choice? And companies so often are approaching it as what bells and whistles can we add and to attract customers? How can we make more colors, more flavors? What can we do to make the offering more appealing so that they will buy our product and service? What causes a customer to buy a product or service is not the attributes of the product. It's something they're struggling with in their life. We'll call it a job that they are trying to solve in some way. So, which product or service are they going to choose to pull into their life to help them solve that struggle, that job in their life? The job may be, I want to feel like a good mother. That's the job in my life. So what solutions am I going to pull into my life? I'm going to pull into my life cooking solutions that make it possible for me to make what feels like a nourishing meal for my kids, but aren't going to stress me out. Or it may be that I still remember when we got one of the original Amazon Echoes way back when I first started. And I remember saying to myself, oh, I'm getting it because we need more music in our life. And in reality, the job I was trying to hire it for was something really fun for Christmas morning when we were past the age of our kids being delighted by the things under the tree or in the stocking. And that it turned out to be great until you understand what job your customers are hiring your products or services. You're going to try to sell people things, but you're not really understanding where they're coming from. One of my favorite examples to explain why this is powerful. In what world is a Nintendo, a pint of Ben and Jerry's, a bottle of wine, and a massage? In what world are they competitors? They're all competing for the job of help me relax when I come home from a really stressful day. So when you take that thinking, what's the job to be done that I'm being hired for by the relationships in my life, by the people in my life? It's seldom cut and dried features and benefits. It's seldom to be a provider or to make sure we have fun vacations. People in our lives may want something different from us that does have an emotional component. I might be hiring my husband so that I feel understood every day, or I feel seen every day, or I I might be hiring, my best friends to have someone who understands what it's like to juggle things and to just have that empathy with each other. So it's not about the tasks we do when we're together. It's about the whole picture of what I'm needing from that person. And it's a very valuable way, I think, to frame how can I be a better fill in the blank spouse, friend, daughter, sister, etc. Is what do I think the job they're hiring me for is?
Great insight there. And you're right. The same is true in our relationships. We go into them thinking about what we want rather than what is important to the other person. And many unhappy marriages are often built on selflessness. But the selflessness is based on partners giving each other things that they want to give rather than the things their partner actually needs. So that's an important distinction to make. And it's really applicable in both a professional and a personal context. Let's move into another part of the book and talk about what parallels do you see between Michael Dell's decision to outsource core capabilities and parents, which I see this a lot, who outsource too much of their role to other people in their children's development.
It's a really interesting part of the book and something I was thinking about a lot as we were writing the book because my kids were sort of at the age where this was really relevant. Michael Dell got really good over time when it was in its earlier stages of figuring out what tasks and aspects of building its computers could be outsourced to a supplier, basically, so that they could continue to be more and more profitable. So how much can we outsource so that we don't have to manufacture and do all of these things ourselves? And little by little, they particularly ended up outsourcing a lot of those things to a company called ASUS, ASUS. And ASUS would, yep, we can figure out how to put the processor, and yes, we can figure out how to make your screen thinner. They did all the things they were asked. But over time, as they outsourced more and more and more of those tasks, what happened was ASUS also learned a lot, not just about the actual components of creating a computer or a laptop. It learned about the processes that made them successful that you had to work on internally. It began to understand the customer in a different way. In outsourcing all of these individual, theoretically, components of making something, what it ultimately was outsourcing, Dell was outsourcing, was what a lot of what made Dell unique and special. And it became what really made ASUS unique and special. And so ultimately, ASUS launched its own competitor and had just learned so much about the intangible things, the processes and how you devote resources and planning and how you interface with customers, that effectively Dell had outsourced maybe the most valuable stuff over time. It's a really powerful lesson for parents too. All of us are so busy and we want our kids to have great experiences. So we outsource a lot of the things we want for our kids. We outsource, coaching, to be on sports teams, and we outsource, learning musical instruments and childcare and tutors and all kinds of things that, again, are always intended to be in the best interest of our children. You start to realize that partly what you're outsourcing, if you do as much of it as a typical busy parent maybe wants to or wishes they had the money to do, you may be outsourcing some of the most valuable stuff that you could be giving your kids too, your values, right? Outsource the things that allow you to have more time with your kids, not the things that allow you to have more time away from your kids. That's what I would choose to do.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.